Ladies and gentlemen, if you're new here, this here is a Chevy Silverado that I was lucky enough to buy on Copart for a $125 bid. Granted, yes, with fees and delivery, I paid a total of $500 for it, which obviously still is an absolute killer deal. In the last video, I swapped these two doors that had some damages on it, figured out why it didn't want to start, changed the tires on this thing, and took this car for a drive, finding out that it has a bad transmission. I think the what am I gonna do? I don't want to swap the trans, which is a very, very common problem on these trucks. And unfortunately, I have no options but to swap it. And that's what we're going to do today. And then if all goes well with the transmission, we are gonna have my body guy, Zach, who's a neighbor of my shop, try and fix this cab. In many cases, a blown transmission would be enough for me to give up on the vehicle and flipping. But with how cheap I bought this truck, there is still a very significant profit margin, even though I had to replace the transmission and do some engine repairs. After removing both of the drive shafts, the next step is to get rid of our brace that holds the transfer case and the back of the transmission to the car. Then we can disconnect the electrical connection to the transmission. And work on removing the dipstick. Next, we've got the exhaust. Okay, we've run into our first major issue. Some of you guys might remember from the last video, we had some exhaust modifications from the previous owner. And by modifications, I mean that they deleted their cats, or the catalytic converters. Chances are this is because of the misfires that the motor has been having, so potentially they didn't want to fix the misfires, and the cats ended up melting, and this was their fix, getting rid of them. And there's also a deleted resonator here. Because of it being all welded up like this means that I have to remove the entire exhaust because there is 0 clamps throughout the entire system, which was okay with me up until, well, this was relatively expected. I removed one of the nuts for our downpipe, and then that one over there got stripped. Not sure how visible that is to you guys, but yeah, that boy is not coming off. At least not at this time. So, instead of cutting here and there, I just did it over here. And even though I'm not going to be able to get a clamp on this, I can pretty easily weld this, I think. There's decent access from the top. The reason why I didn't want to do a cut here is because I don't think I would be able to get a clamp on here because of the O2 sensor being right there. And this bend, I don't think there's enough space for me to squeeze in a decent clamp that won't leak. And this way I only have to do 2 cuts instead of 3. Kind of unfortunate that I can't take the exhaust off, but trying to deal with those studs on the exhaust manifolds, just really not something I'm willing to put up with. It's looking like this truck is going to be so much work already that I'm not willing to give myself any extra work. At this point, I can lower the back of the transmission as much as it will let me so that I can get to the bell housing bolts. However, something I really didn't notice until it was way too late is the fact that the exhaust ends up sitting on this part of the frame, and that keeps the engine from going down all the way, which made the removal of all the bell housing bolts significantly harder, but still manageable. But before I can remove all of the bell housing bolts, we need to disconnect the flywheel from the torque converter. And to get access to those guys, we first need to remove the starter, held by 2 bolts and covered with a 1-inch layer of oil, and then use that opening to find the 3 bolts connecting the torque converter to the flywheel. I have to manually rotate the engine 120 degrees to get from one bolt to the next. Now onto the most annoying part of this project is the top bell housing bolts. Those are pretty much invisible with how little articulation I have from the engine and transmission assembly. So we have to use some very, very long extensions to try and get to those. And then I save the easiest side bolts for the very end. It felt like this moment would never come, but I finally have all of the bell housing bolts off. Looks like we have 8 of these guys. And of course, as always, these 2 were the hardest. There's still supposed to be the second nut over here, but that's somewhere on top of the bell housing. So now, without further ado, we gotta try and yank this thing out of there by ourselves. This might be a challenge. With how tall my transmission jack is, there's very little clearance for getting the transmission from under the car and having the car lift at the very top. Luckily, my friend Dean was very kind to come out and help me get this thing from under the truck. Everybody say, thanks, Dean. Okay, can't say this was a very enjoyable job, but we got it done. The 2 top bell housing bolts were an absolute pain in the butt, but again, we got it done. I think overall, this whole job took me about, let's call it 8 hours. And these 2 bolts, each one took probably an hour at least. It's just a matter of figuring out how to get to them. And for a long time, I didn't even know that there is that second nut on top of there that holds a bracket that is a 13 millimeter. So because I can't see these, I was feeding in a 15 mil, trying to get it on the nut, kept spinning it, and nothing would happen. Rebuild guy I just found on Facebook. He just had a listing saying that he rebuilds these transmissions. And currently he has like a promotion where he throws in a billet torque converter cover with a purchase price of $2,500 for the entire rebuild transmission. And then I guess I just bring him the core. So right off the bat, I can tell that I feel like this pan was off quite recently because all of these bolts are, I feel like they should be tighter. I feel like there should be at least a little like click. I feel like I might even be able to undo this by hand. Yep, look at that. That's why this whole transmission was so wet, is because this was finger tight. Considering everything else in this truck, I mean, I'm not super surprised. I'm guessing the previous owners knew that there was a transmission issue. They probably removed the pan to see what they're dealing with, maybe change the fluid, and maybe forgot to torque down the bolts. And then they crashed the truck? Or was this an insurance scam and they crashed it on purpose? Because it does seem like whoever used it in the past did everything possible to keep things as cheap as possible. Oh yeah, somebody cleaned this thing out for sure. The transmission fluid doesn't look super fresh, but I feel like there should be significantly more gunk here at the bottom, considering how bad our transmission is behaving. But honestly, like if it wasn't for the loose bolts, I would look at this and I would say, oh, this transmission seems fine. So tomorrow morning, we're gonna be taking this transmission and trading it as well as $2,500 for a rebuilt transmission with a billet torque converter cover. The guy I brought it to, Ryan, seemed to have been very knowledgeable and was able to put it together very confidently. There was a bit of a time conflict due to which I ended up sitting at his shop for 2 hours watching him put the whole thing together, but at least I got to see all of that, so that's a bonus. My cheap transmission jack is definitely not happy about having this giant transmission on it. It's starting to bend in places it shouldn't, and it makes this very sketchy. Luckily, it didn't break my legs and did what is expected of it and got this transmission into the truck. All right, let's see if it starts or if it drives. Yes, there is zero exhaust, there's zero cats. All right, we are on drive. The RPMs did drop and it wants to move. Foot is off the brake and it is not moving. It is not moving at all. It's rolling a little bit. I don't like this. All right, now that the transmission is in, I'm sorry I didn't really record that. I had a friend here helping me out. Thank you, Nikita, for your help. And I also just really needed to get this done so that this thing is movable and is off the lift. Long story short, this thing is now drivable, as you saw, and there's still a lot of things for us to do. One thing that is freaking me out about this transmission, though, is the fact that the capacity in these is 12 quarts of transmission fluid. We've put in 10, and it's already way too high. I don't know if this is very visible to you guys, if this thing can freaking focus. When cold, the level is supposed to be right around here, and as you can see, our level is up here. Granted, I did not drain the transmission cooler, so that's something that somebody might bring up, is that normally you would want to do that when you have transmission issues, because you might have metal shavings stuck in your transcooler that are going to make their way back into the new transmission. The thing is that when we tore apart the old transmission, there was zero metal shavings. That thing looked almost perfect. Like, you wouldn't have guessed that something's wrong with it, apart from the little screens in the TCM module thing. I really don't know what those things are called. So those were cracked, and those, I was told, cause issues with shifting. And we also don't know what kind of condition the clutches were in. I mean, maybe we just let it run and see if it'll come down. But the thing is that I don't really want to let it run inside the shop, because we have no cats and we also have no exhaust, like, whatsoever. We have those things cut off. I haven't had a chance to weld those yet. So this thing is ridiculously loud, and there's just a lot of other things for me to do before I need to really worry about what the transmission fluid is doing. Some of the things we need to do outside of that is, well, the exhaust, that is a big one, and the sway bar, also a big one. Both of them are an issue due to poor material quality. As unfortunate as that just happens on domestics. Yeah, that's all I can say. It looks like we do have some fluid over here on the skid plate again, and I think our transfer case is leaking, so that's another thing I could do, or should do, or will do. I think the first thing I'm gonna work on is the transmission thermostat. So this is a common modification to these transmissions, because apparently this was a bad design from Chevy. Believe it or not, that does exist. Apparently these thermostats let these transmissions run too hot, and that frequently cooks them, or cooks the fluid, and then because of that, the transmission gets cooked. There are a few different ways of attacking this. One of the ways is to completely replace this thermostat with an aftermarket unit that closes and opens at a lower temperature. But it looks like a lot of people are having pretty good results with simply deleting the insides of the thermostat and basically keeping it from ever closing. So right in there, there's this thermostat that is activated by a spring, and when it reaches a certain temperature, this thing opens up and lets transmission fluid go through the transmission cooler, in turn cooling down the transmission fluid. The problem is that this happens a little too late at a little too high of a temperature, so the ATF doesn't really like to be at that temperature. So a solution to this problem is to install this guy. This is basically a one-piece unit that combines the thermostat piece with the cap piece. It simply plugs in there. And what this does is make sure that the fluid at all times is simply just circulating through the oil cooler, keeping the transmission fluid nice and cool at all times. So on this side, as I planned, we're just gonna use a clamp. That's no issues. This side here is gonna need to be welded. This downpipe was a little loose. I think it was because of those studs being really rusty and the nuts not being able to slide on all the way. This is just how I got the truck, and yeah, when I was working on all this, I noticed that this downpipe was pretty loose in there. And as it turns out, these 3 nuts actually did manage to come off. I didn't even try that after I saw that one get stripped. But the reason why that's important is because I think this was causing an exhaust leak, which was obviously pre-oxygen sensor, meaning that this could have easily been causing our misfires. So that's what I'm gonna hope for. And once I try and fix those studs, maybe we'll be able to get this to sit on there properly and not cause an exhaust leak. So we're gonna use a tap to try and clear out the threads on these nuts, because it looks like that's where the majority of our issue is. If I had known that these nuts were gonna come off, I didn't have to make one of these exhaust cuts, but I guess it is what it is. Yeah, that is nice and solid. Perfect, okay. My welds have never been pretty, and today is no exception, but I think that is going to, well, hopefully mostly not leak. Now while we have the welder out, we're gonna try and get these stupid bolts out for the sway bar. And for that, I'm just gonna throw these nuts on them and try and weld it on and see if the heat will loosen this up, and if it doesn't, then we'll just use a socket and unscrew that. That is really seized up in there, huh? All right, these sway bar bolts are really being stubborn, and to keep myself from getting too frustrated, I think I'm gonna save these for tomorrow and try and do our transfer case seal. Not saying that's gonna be much easier, but meh. Luckily, when it comes to the seal, there's not too many bolts to deal with, except for these 11 millimeters for the U-joint. And they should come off with relative ease because we just had them off. This guy out of there. Hopefully this thing isn't gonna fight us too much, but last one I did of these was also in a Silverado, and it was quite a pain. And 30 minutes later, here we are. And before we install our new seal, we just have to clean up the mating surfaces to make sure that it installs properly and doesn't leak at all. Now we just gently tap it in and make sure not to damage it in the process, until it's sitting nice and flush. And then lastly, as per the manual, we need to fill the transfer case with transmission fluid up until it starts leaking out fluid. Okay, I'm getting absolutely nowhere with welding this thing. These things are just absolutely seized in there. I can't come up with any feasible way of getting this out. So I think we're just gonna grind this off, make this flat, and cut up these bolts and just weld them on like studs, and then use a regular nut to slide it onto the stud, and I think that should work. All right guys, based on the manual, the car needs to be running for us to check the fluid, so maybe that's why it's showing so high. So let's go ahead and start it, which is a bit of a big moment because we don't know if it's gonna still misfire after we fixed our downpipe. We don't know if it's gonna sound okay now that the entire exhaust is back together and kind of welded. I say kind of because there's a possibility for an exhaust leak, and it would probably sound really bad if it does have it. Anyway, let's start it. Okay, it's not painfully loud anymore, so that's good. I'm also gonna shift through a few gears, make sure that everything engages. Hold it in every gear for a little while. Okay, the misfires are still going on, so that is unfortunate. I guess we have an issue elsewhere. It runs like absolute crap. We have a lot of misfires. Okay, so far so good. It shifted. Oh. and then it didn't shift. Okay, oh great, something's not right. Okay, so at this point I started getting really worried. I started thinking that maybe our new transmission is bad. Maybe the issue wasn't transmission in the beginning. However, I did notice some differences in how the car was handling, and I think we need to reset our adaptations and let the transmission and the ETCM relearn, because it's been driving with this terribly acting transmission for so long, so the ECM has learned to try and cope with that. Plus, we still have those misfires, and misfires do cause very rough driving. They can affect how the transmission shifts and what happens in between those shifts. So, honestly, there's still more work to be done. Let's focus on the misfires. Okay, so I have our scanner plugged in, and we're looking at our misfire counter, and it looks like our only misfires are on cylinder 3. So the good news is that we know where to look for the problem. The bad news is that it drives way too terribly for it to just be a one-cylinder misfire. I don't think, unless Chevy does something very, very differently from every other car, that one-cylinder misfire, it's not going to make the car feel like it has a transmission that's about to blow up. Yeah, it looks like cylinder 3 has a lot of historical misfires too, like a lot. Okay. Still cylinder 3. As you already know, I am an absolute idiot, and it turns out Chevy does their cylinder numbering very differently from cars I'm used to. Unless I'm going crazy and Audi does it this way too, but no, I'm pretty sure Audi is always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, starting on passenger side. Apparently, Chevy does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Regardless, turns out our misfiring cylinder is this guy over here, not there. That was all a waste of time. This is from cylinder 5. This is from cylinder 3 that has a problem. And this actually seems to have a different brand spark plug, which is also coated in oil or fuel. Oh, I think that's fuel. So the fuel is telling me that there is no ignition happening in the cylinder. And the fact that it's a new spark plug is telling me that the previous owners have probably tried swapping the spark plug. Regardless, we're gonna throw it in the 5th cylinder. We're gonna take the coil from the 1st cylinder. Yep, somebody has marked these before me. How convenient. But I don't think this was the case on the other side, so somebody has been messing with this bank, which is kind of bad news. Potentially they've already tried doing this and never managed to fix their misfire. The fact that this truck has no cats, I mean, that's kind of telling me that chances are this thing was misfiring for a real long time and melted its cats. Aha! Oh, interesting. Yeah, so we are getting some misfires on cylinder 1 and a lot on cylinder 3 still. Cylinder 5 misfired once. Next, I see no choice but to do a compression test. So we pulled the fuse box. We found out that our fuel pump fuse is this guy right here. We're gonna take this guy, get it out of here so that the car is not getting fuel. I am pretty sure the car is gonna start because I didn't let it crank with no fuel pressure. There's still a little bit of fuel left in the fuel lines, so it's probably going to start up briefly and then die. Or maybe not. We'll see what happens. Okay, 100 PSI. More or less, that's something. I am gonna check cylinder 1 just to compare. I mean, looks like pretty much the same. Okay, so these compression readings are not ideal. Having low hundreds on cylinder 3 is slightly concerning, but I don't think it's enough to cause such a bad misfire. It looks like the cylinder 3 doesn't fire whatsoever, at all. And every time I've pulled out the spark plug, I've noticed that it's really wet. So I wonder if maybe we have a stuck fuel injector. That would kind of explain it, right? I think that would make sense. Hope they're not too hard to get to and not too hard to put it back together. I'm just gonna swap the 2 injectors, cross my fingers, and hope that the misfire moves. Okay, supposedly that's all the 10 mils. Oh yeah, this thing is loose. Perfect. All right, now that comes off. So aside from this little guy being broken here, which I'm pretty sure I did not do, everything looks adequate here. And it doesn't look like these bolts for the injectors were ever touched. Okay, none of these were clamped either, and it just kind of falls off like that. That could be causing a whole bunch of vacuum leaks. Like, this is definitely going to be leaking vacuum and causing a misfire at idle. This guy right here is going to be absolutely perfect for removing this line to the fuel rail. And I actually found a few of these in one of my cars that I got from an auction. It was a repo and it came with a bunch of tools in it. Place to the fuel rail. I think all three first injectors are now free. Oh, and there goes the fourth. All right. I think our fuel rail is free. There we go. All right. Sweet, finally. Okay, got it done. Okay, all of these injectors don't look so great. This number 7 or whatever this is, I mean, it's practically clogged. Here we can at least see some of the holes. There we go, that looks nice. That looks acceptable. Of course, this might have just happened from me pulling them out, but they do look a little rough. Yeah, I don't think anyone has taken these out. These seals are pretty cooked. And we just ripped the O-ring. There we go, we got some spraying going on. I mean, it's not great, but it does what it's supposed to. And even though the cylinder 3 injector seems to be doing what it's meant to do, I'm going to swap it with the cylinder 1 injector just to see if anything changes. All right, so as far as all these hoses go, I am just going to use some zip ties that are on the larger side. That should be enough. These aren't pressurized or anything. I mean, there's a little bit of vacuum going through, but not enough to make these pop off. So we're just going to throw these zip ties on, and that should be sufficient to hold these guys in place. All right, I think everything is buttoned back up. Should be good to try and check if this helped us at all. Cylinder 3 still misfiring consistently. That sucks. And cylinder 1 misfires occasionally. I'm starting to really hate this truck. This is just really not working out. Not the injector, not the spark. Well, actually, I've tested the fact that it's not the coil or the spark plug. I never tested whether the spark plug actually gets power. So maybe we should pull the spark plug out, plug it in, and see if it actually sparks when we try and crank it. I've got the spark plug pulled out. We have it grounded right here with a jumper cable. That should be enough to let it spark. Probably a terrible idea to start it with the spark plug removed, but whatever. That is loud. Yeah. Okay, that was a terrifying experience. Never started a motor with a spark plug removed before, but what we do know is that the spark plug fires. So we have spark, we have fuel, we have compression somewhat. It's gotta be something in the top end, right? Lifters, whatever, AFM stuff, I know nothing about that. All I know is that I'm getting real freaking sick of working on this thing. On that note, I think we can call this video good, because I have no idea when I'm gonna get to this friggin' truck again. I'm getting real sick and tired of working on it. Maybe a $125 truck isn't such a good idea after all. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.